Hi, this is Nahid Kazaza. In our April Learning Forum, we are going to focus in on people who don't meet deadlines. They can be so frustrating to work with, especially when you have a project that needs to be completed on time. You can feel like you keep asking for things, you keep coming to agreements about when it'll be done, and then the day comes and it's not done. And it can just really throw a wrench in your work team and the trust on your work team. So what we'll focus on is how do you bring these people along without turning into a micromanager if you're a leader? And what are some other ways that you can get people inspired and motivated and focused and meeting their deadlines?
So the first thing we're going to do is have you do a little bit of self-reflection. I want you to think of some times when you depended on somebody else to get something done so that you could get your work done, or it could be a similar situation when you depended on somebody just not to flake on you, to be there for you, or to do something that they had promised. And how did it affect you? So when we got our people together in a best practices forum, we asked them to come up with some examples of personal situations and work situations. And in the work situation, we asked, how did it impact your ability to get your work done? What was your opinion of the people who or person that didn't get back to you? Did you try anything to get them to change, and did that work? And if it was a personal situation, how did it impact your relationship? What did you begin to think or believe about the person? And did you try anything to get them to change? So we had people share some stories and examples, and what I'm going to play for you is a very short excerpt of our audio class.
They had all the requirements that were necessary, but somehow or another, whether it was lack of talent, and in turn lack of skill, or lack of time, that they didn't actually truly meet their time commitment. It was met later on, but not when they said it was going to be met. Mm-hmm. So not accurately forecasting or assessing their time commitment really hurt us in the end. And what was my opinion of the team? Mm-hmm. It was pretty low.
It's frustrating for me because one guy, he's been traveling and doing great work. He just hasn't been telling me what he's doing, so then I can't report out to our program manager the status. And so it's really frustrating for me. And the way it feels like, oh, this guy doesn't respect me because he didn't give what I requested. And then it makes me feel like I don't look good in front of my new boss, and therefore the team isn't looking good.
So my wife sometimes doesn't meet her financial commitments, and I carry more of the financial load than we agree to. My opinion of her when that happens is pretty low. I think she's irresponsible, and I get kind of angry. I try and change her behavior in the situation by explaining my side, what I think needs to change, and putting up boundaries for myself in the relationship. And does that work? Kind of, sort of, not really. Especially the anger doesn't really help the situation.
And how does it impact your relationship?
Oh, it hurts it. The trust.
The trust, yeah.
Yeah. I get really frustrated with the relationship as a whole because of this one issue.
A really long drive to go to the restaurant we were meeting at because I was doing it by her work, which was kind of far. It was like, 30 minutes away from me. And she never showed. And I was so just hurt and frustrated. And my initial thought was that I'm not important to her. And, and she did call several hours later that afternoon and apologize that it had totally slipped her mind. But that was a turning point in our relationship because I felt like I'm just not important enough to her for her to remember any of her commitments to me or reach out or take the initiative. So in that relationship, I lost trust, And I just started protecting myself. And the way I started protecting myself is I just stopped taking the initiative just to see if she would take the initiative, and she didn't, and so I let the friendship go. Does anyone have an observation they want to make? As you've heard all of these stories, have you noticed any pattern or anything that's come up that seems similar in all the stories?
Okay.
I heard lack of respect.
Yes.
I heard loss of trust.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so we stop respecting people, we stop trusting people. So it really erodes the relationship, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you hear the stories, you can see that there are a lot of effects of people who don't meet deadlines. So first of all, they often, without realizing it, cause others to look bad because they can't complete their own work on time or put others in really bad or inconvenient situations. And typically, if that's happened to us, we develop a really low opinion of the person who has flaked on us or who hasn't met the deadline, and we start thinking much less of them. And then if there's a pattern of lateness or missed commitments, it tends to color the whole relationship. So just this one issue of, no matter how much I ask you to do this, you're just not doing it, or you're not following through. No matter how many times you promise, you really aren't following through. And that erodes trust. And trust is the foundation of both work relationships, one-on-one, work teams, and personal relationships. And we're going to look more into that later. But before we do that, what we need to do is understand what's behind this behavior. Because in order to deal with this behavior, we have to understand it. So what I asked people to do next was really think hard about when you didn't meet a deadline. And I'm going to ask you to think about that right now. And you may have a hard time coming up with an example because it's not something that we really like to think about, especially if we like to think of ourselves as responsible. But after some thought, people in the class were able to think of some examples. And although it felt bad, revealing it gave us some insights into what is behind the pattern. Here's another little excerpt of our audio class so you can hear what some of the shares were.
I haven't done it because I don't totally understand or agree with the feedback I'm supposed to pass on to this individual. I want to do it because I was asked to, and I want to be of service to both sides, the boss and the individual team member.
I told her I was going to call her on Sunday, and I didn't call her until yesterday. And I felt really bad about doing it, but somehow or another, Sunday got away from me. I know that on Monday, it got kind of late when I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm just not going to call her because it's just too late. And then yesterday, I, quote unquote, tried to make up for it, but I still feel very guilty.
I was out of work, so my sister said, would you like to help clean my house? And I said, I would love to. And I would go, and then I would start to psych out. And I wanted to please her. I want to help her. And my heart wasn't into it.
Usually I'm tired when they approach me, and they'll come up with their idea, and it'll sound fine because they'll make such an eloquent argument. But then when I said, well, yeah, that sounds like it'd probably be okay, once they leave and I think about it for a while, I think of all the reasons why it really isn't okay, and I really don't want them to do whatever the thing is. So then usually I go back to them and say, well, I've been thinking about it, and I actually don't want to do this. And then they get really mad at me, of course, because I made a promise and then I reneged on it.
And there's a few behaviors my wife doesn't like in me, and, we've talked and she's explained why she doesn't like them. I've agreed to try and change them, and it's been kind of a, I've had mixed results, but a lot of times, I'm totally proud to be saying this, a lot of times I engage in those behaviors as a way of, so ridiculous.
As a way of
like,
what?
As a way,
say it clearly.
Like getting back, like out of anger. like I guess that's like passive aggressive or whatever, but like I'll engage in those behaviors like as like a screw you to my wife if I'm mad at her.
So when we listen to people's stories, what do we learn? In some cases, the reason people procrastinate or don't follow through on what they promised is because they actually aren't really clear on how to do it. And that happens a lot of times when you take direction from a boss and maybe you're not comfortable a lot telling your boss that you need help or you need more clarity because you don't want to appear stupid or incompetent. Other cases, maybe it just sounded good when you talked about it, but then when you started thinking about it later, it didn't sound so easy. Another reason that's very common is we don't anticipate how our day will go or how much time something will take, and the day just gets away with us. And this happens in business a lot with software projects. Construction projects are kind of notorious for taking, 3 to 5 times as long as the original estimate. But even when we go into work and we bring our to-do lists with us, most of us misjudge how much we can do in a day. So this happens to all of us. Often we want to please someone because we love them and care about the relationship. So we'll agree to do something just because we can't even imagine saying no to someone that we care about. So if they say, hey, let's do this, the yes sort of slips out of our mouth before we even think about, well, gosh, I don't really want to do that. But then later, as it gets closer to the event, we start trying to squirm out of it because we start realizing how we really don't want to spend our time that way. Sometimes we feel pushed to agree to something because there's that urgency factor. It has to be decided right now. Someone's maybe giving you an eloquent plea for something, so you'll agree to it because they're making a great case that sounds really good, but then when you sit back and think about it, you realize all the other things that they didn't bring up that make it not such a good idea or not something that you want to agree to. So later you realize that you don't agree. And sometimes we're seriously angry at someone. This happens a lot in closer relationships, like relationships with your spouse or your boss. And it may be a pattern where you just feel like, um, you haven't been treated well in the relationship for a long period of time. Maybe you don't feel really empowered. And so sometimes you're just so angry and you get people back by not doing what you know they want. And they call that passive aggression. But one thing to keep in mind is that with these reasons and other reasons, if you look at what they have in common, a lot of it is that we're not having authentic dialogue or we're not telling people our truth. Patrick Lenciani has a model that talks about how teams get great results. This is a very popular model. A lot of people use it. I use it with a lot of my clients. The reason I bring it into this classroom discussion is because it's a simple model that really ties accountability and trust together. So often you may look at a team or look at another person and notice they're not following through on things and get really furious. And your first thought is, I need to get results. Someone needs to hold them accountable. And we start trying to hold those people accountable. But notice that results and accountability are the top two levels of this pyramid. And this pyramid model essentially says that you need to have the foundational levels of the pyramid in place before you can have each level that gets, each subsequently higher level. So you need trust to have conflict. And in this case, we're talking about good conflict, which means openly and respectfully talking about things that we disagree on. And if we do that, then we'll commit to a decision that we make because we've had our voice heard, and then we'll be accountable to that decision and to that commitment that we make, and then we'll get results. Well, what we often find when we're in situations where people aren't meeting deadlines is that they're not accountable. And what that usually means is that they were never truly 100% committed to their agreement in the first place. And what that often means is that they never really shared their full voice. They never really said what they thought about the decision when the original conversation or the original agreement was made. And in order to create that, you need to have trust. You need to make it safe for people to feel comfortable telling you how they really feel. So that's one of the first strategies that we use when it comes to working with people who are kind of flaky or not dealing with deadlines is we try to create a safe space for them to say no. And that's not easy, and it takes time, and it often takes several conversations. So typically, we'll make a differentiation about whether or not it's worth it to have the conversation because some people who are flaky, we just either accommodate or by realizing that when they say something, it's probably going to be, twice as long. For example, a contractor comes, you're not necessarily going to want to sit down and have an authentic dialogue with a building contractor about his estimates. Maybe you will, but the thing is sometimes we have to prioritize who we have these authentic dialogues with. And if somebody is distant enough from you, sometimes it's easier just to let the relationship go or to tolerate the behavior and protect yourself from it with boundaries and resetting your expectations based on your own predictions that you know that they're going to flake. So since you know they're going to flake or you know that they're not going to be very reliable, you just kind of work that into your schedule. I know I have a lot of people in my life that I know aren't always on time to things, and I just assume that they're going to be a little bit later, and I sort of work around it and it doesn't bother me too much. But with the relationships that matter, and those tend to be spouses, siblings, bosses, employees that are directly on your team, anybody you work with that affects your work, and anybody that you're in relationship with that affects your well-being or peace of mind, you really do have to have that authentic conversation. And, on a lighter side, keep in mind that often people just don't anticipate what the future will be very effectively. Most of us don't. And so sometimes it just requires patience and trying to think through things a little bit more carefully together through our past experiences. What I'd like to do to wrap up is share with you some of the closing comments that people in our class made about what they got out of the session.
Well, one thing that we learned that is when people are flaky, that we see that it really erodes the trust. And I think and then once you erode the trust with that person, it tends to, so you start thinking more negatively about that person.
I think the two things that are top of mind to me are, number one, giving people permission to say no. That when people are very close to us, especially whether it's a work relationship or a personal relationship, they feel they don't have the right to say no. And so they only reluctantly say yes, and then they flake, or perhaps even worse, they undermine. They let us know at the last minute that they've changed their mind, knowing that we're left in the lurch. But the second thing that I think is really important to me is making sure that people, particularly in a work situation, have the tools they need to follow through on their commitments. That sometimes they truly want to follow through, but they're uncomfortable, not with the issue of saying no, they're uncomfortable with asking for help.
Well, I love that. What we came to was the fact that, first of all, just having a conversation with the person and making it safe for them to say no. Because a lot of people, not only do they say they feel like they can't say no, they feel an obligation to do whatever it is that you're wanting to do with them. And having a conversation, making it very clear, maybe what it means to you, what it means to, do this activity, whatever. Making that very clear to the person and kind of getting the buy-in, really.
I want to thank all of you for sharing the insights that we got out of our discussion. I'm going to be incorporating this into the PowerPoint on this topic, and we're going to be sending it out to people maybe, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.